So in this tutorial, we're going to look at using different, or an Unwrap UVW map and using different bitmaps to create a material that has complexity of different reflectivity, different perforation, different patterns. So we'll start by I just have this basic form here. I'm going to start by adding the Unwrap UVW map. Okay, and then once you've unwrapped it, you can open the UV editor. And there are a few ways you can unwrap this geometry. So the first thing you want to do is zoom out, select your faces, select everything, and then you go to mapping, flatten mapping. You can also unfold mapping, or you can try pelt mapping, which is over here. In this example, we're just going to use flatten mapping, and then just say OK. And it should scale everything to fit within your UV tile. So this is where, in this tile, this is where you'll create your different map patterns and stuff. So first thing you have to do is export this, and if you go to File, or sorry, Option, no, Tools, Render UVW Template. You want to make sure you render this at very high resolution. So let's go with like 8,000 by 8,000 for this one. The higher resolution, the better quality the image will be that's applied to your object. So the higher this is, the higher resolution the image will be. So once you have that, you can just render the UV template. You should get something like this. And then once you have that, go ahead and save it. And we'll just save it. There are a few different file formats you can use. I'm just going to use a JPEG for now. And I'll save this to my desktop. We'll just call this like background. Save. Okay, so I saved my UV template as a JPEG, and now I'm in Rhino. You could do this in Rhino or any drafting program like AutoCAD. I'll just use Rhino for this example. So the first thing you want to do is create picture frame. If you type in picture frame, that'll then bring up a browsing window. You can then browse for the image. So here's my background JPEG. If you're in AutoCAD, you can just insert raster image. I'm going to open that, and then I'll type in 0, 0, 0, and that'll be the beginning of it. And then if I hold down Shift, I can sort of orthogonally do this. And it doesn't really matter the scale as long as everything is to the same proportion. So I'll just go ahead and start there. And then this is your background that you'll want to use to draw all over. You can change the transparency of this if you want, change the kind of other features of it, but now you can just start drawing. So what I'll probably do is create a different layer or work on a different layer. So I might actually freeze or lock that background layer so that I don't select it, and then you can start drawing lines. So for example, if I just draw, let's just do a spline here. I'll try to trace one of these. Sorry, let's do curve. So I can just use curve and create a curve through freeform, control points, or interpolate points, or you can draw a line and then fill it between those lines. But for now, I'll just go curve, freeform. Let's do control points, and then I'll just go ahead and like draw over this. And you don't want to have too many lines. You don't want it to look kind of like sketchy line. You want it to be fairly constructed, but this will give a good, at least beginning of what I'm trying to do here. You could just continue to trace that, or you could offset. So really this is up to you. This is what I'm drawing here is basically the pattern that I will put on the building. So all these lines that I'm drawing now will actually show up as lines on the building. And then maybe you add like a circle to the end here. I don't know, it could be that you want to create, I'm going to type in line, I'm going to create another line that kind of bisects this. And then just continue to draw a pattern. And the idea here is that you're drawing a pattern for the diffuse map. So I can take these lines in Illustrator, change line thickness, line color. That will I'll apply that to the diffuse map of the material. and then I might like fill, some of these circles, and those might be the perforated pattern, and then I might fill some of these squares, or some of these, or draw a new pattern that might be reflectivity. So I'll go ahead and do that now, and then we can talk about how to insert those into the material. Okay, so I've now drawn a series of lines, and what I did over here is I created different layers. So I created a layer for my diffuse lines, a layer for reflection lines, bump lines, opacity lines. So if I turn off my image, you can see some of these lines here. So for example, the diffuse lines are just these red lines, so I'll use these as like a line weight and line color that'll go onto the texture. And then I will use these lines to help divide and add fill for reflection. So I'll add some kind of reflection within some of these cells, but not all of them. Then I have a bump. So I'm going to use these just in lines to create a kind of bump in the surface. And then I have opacity. So all these little holes down here I'll use to create different opacity, so perforation within the geometry. So I have all these lines, so I'm now ready to export to AutoCAD. So if you save this, you can just save it as a DWG. Let's do this as DWG. I'll just call this maps. Make sure you save as like 2004 lines should work. Okay, and then open up Illustrator. Okay, so now you're in Illustrator. You can go ahead and open, file open, and then find that drawing. And then you might want to scale this. If you drew it really big, I'm not really sure what scale I drew it to, so for now I'll just do like 1/4 inch, which is 48. It's 12 times 4 units equals 1. And since it's a raster drawing, you can always just put it in. If it's a wrong scale, you could try again a different scale. And you can always scale these up, and you'll keep the resolution. So now that it's open, the first thing you want to check is that your layers came through. So I'll turn on my layers. So I have all my layers. So this will help me organize the drawing and create these different maps. And then I want to make sure I have a file size that's appropriate. So this file size, the size of the page, the document size, really matters, because even though I exported as a 8000 by 8000, that's only the resolution of that image that came out from there. But when I export from Illustrator, that's the resolution of the actual map. So this is really the critical size that you want to do. So let's go ahead and let's go to Document Setup, Edit Artboards, and make sure this drawing size is pretty good. This is 20 inch by 20 inch. It seems pretty decent. So you can see my drawing is much smaller than that. So I'm just going to select everything and actually unlock my image layer here. So select everything and then just scale this up. And you can actually scale it right to the corners of the page. And you want to make sure it's a square. So whatever page it is, it should be a square. So mine's 20 inches by 20 inches. That way I'll match the UV tiling in 3D Max. Okay, and then now that's there, I can actually turn off my image. It doesn't really matter anymore. I have my lines here. So the first map I want to create is my diffuse map. So the diffuse map, if I turn these off, I just want to use these red lines. And so what I'll do is just select these lines, and then you could just choose a color for them in your color palette. So I think I'll make these, let's make these like I don't know, like a bright green or something. Okay, and let's add some thickness to these so they're sort of substantial. So that pattern will now be on the model as soon as I apply that material. So let's go a little thinner on those. Okay, so that's the diffuse map. So you can go ahead and now file, save as. Actually, let's export. You could do a PDF, but let's go file, export. And actually, one thing that really matters, so this color is going to be white on my model. So let's say I want the actual geometry to be a different color. I might just add a box into this that has a fill. So let's make this kind of like purplish. So, and then I want to make sure if I go to Object, Arrange, Send to Back, that it's in the back. So now my whole geometry is going to be this kind of purple color, and then I'll have these green lines on it. So you can see that I just want to make sure all of these outlines are covered in that purple. So I'll just put purple over everything. That'll make the entire geometry purple. Okay, so now we can file, export. Let's export as a TIFF or a JPEG. Let's just do JPEG. I'll do maps diffuse. So I'm saving this as maps diffuse. Save. Okay. And now my diffuse map is saved. So I can go ahead and turn that off. And now let's look at the opacity. So all these other maps need to be black and white. So opacity, reflection, bump. And we'll start with opacity. So I'm going to go ahead and select all these. I'll add a fill because I want these to be holes. So if it's black, that'll make it a fill. So you want to choose a black color. And then this green doesn't really matter. So if I just make that black as well. So let's go ahead and zoom in here. So it didn't really add the fill. So unfortunately, it's not reading those as closed shapes. So what you have to do is select them, go to Object, Live Paint, and then Make, Continue. Use your paint bucket. So if I now go into here, I can use my paint bucket, choose a color for my paint bucket. I'll choose black, and I can start to fill all of these little circles. Okay, so now I have this filled in perforation pattern, so I can now export this as the next layer. So I'll go to File, Export. I'll save, instead of Maps Diffuse, I'll save it as Maps Opacity. And this name could be anything you want. It's just I'm using maps for this example. Okay, now I have the Maps Opacity. Next thing I want to do is reflections. Let's turn that on. So I want, I'm actually going to turn back on my diffuse and then copy these. Actually, I could just start here. So I want to kind of fill some of these squares. So again, once again, I'm going to use Live Paint. So I'll select all these, go to Object, Live Paint, Make, use my paint bucket, and remember again, you still need this to be black. Reflection also, basically these all work on a grayscale. So if you want like very reflective, like a mirror, it'd be 100% black. But if you want it a little less than that, like let's say I want it only like 50% reflective, I'll use a 50% gray. So let's go a little over that, select there, and now I can zoom in and start filling some of these cells. So I could have, oops, gotta reselect that. I don't want to have any stroke here, so I just want to make sure my fill is gray. So now you can start to fill some of these, and so now these will kind of be these like reflective panels on the surface of the geometry. One thing you want to make sure is that with these reflection, opacity, diffuse, or not diffuse, but reflection, opacity, and bump maps are that they're all black and white or grayscale. So I still have those other lines in the background. So you want to make sure that you go to Object, Live Paint, Expand, and expand the geometry, and then go Object, Ungroup, and just ungroup it until they're once again separate objects. And then you can select like one of these green lines and say select same, fill and stroke, and just delete the green lines, and I'll do the same for these lines too. So select same, fill and stroke, delete, and so that gives me the reflective pattern that I want to use for my geometry. So now I can go to File, Export, and then save this as Maps Reflection. Okay, and then the last one I want to do, I'll go ahead and turn that layer off, is a bump map. So I'm just going to use these lines and see what that does. So I'll just select these lines, turn them into black lines, and then give them a pretty big stroke. So let's go 5 there. And now I can save this, or sorry, export as maps bump. And so once you have all your maps, you can go directly back to 3D Max. Okay, so I'm now back in 3D Max, and I just drew all of my different maps over that template. So I'll go ahead and close this. You don't want to ever adjust the geometry after you've created these maps. If you do, you have to recreate the UVW map and then redraw all of the patterns and bumps and so forth. So just keep this map as it is unwrapped. And now we need to apply the material. So open up the material editor. Okay, so this is my material editor, so I'm going to go ahead and start with a new material. You can also use, if you have a material that you downloaded, you could use that as the base. So if you had like a concrete material, you could use that as the base and then just plug these maps into it. But for this example, I'll just start with a basic V-Ray material. So let's go ahead and go to materials. I got to make sure that I set up my V-Ray. Okay, so I've set up V-Ray. Actually, this is actually the studio scene that I sent you. Um, so I can go ahead and create a new material. I'll go to my material palette, double click on a V-Ray material, and so these are all the slots that you want to bring in that image to. So we'll start with a diffuse map, and you can just drag out and then select bitmap from the list here, bitmap, and then find your bitmap. The bitmap for diffuse was this one, so I'll say open. Okay, and then I want to do reflect map, so I'll select a bitmap for that. I'll choose reflection. We then had a bump map, so I'll choose that. Same thing, bitmap, choose bump. And then we had an opacity map. So obviously you can do even more maps, but this is kind of a basic beginning here. Okay, so you got all your maps. It's a V-Ray material, so once you have that, you can just drag this and apply it to the geometry. Sometimes you have to hit this little button here to show map in the viewport. So you can see how it's applying it to the geometry there. So go ahead and open up Photoshop and then open up each of those files, each of those maps. Let's see where I saved mine. And then make sure you go back to, oh, I see what's happening. Make sure you go to image size, and actually maybe this isn't what matters. I think what's happening is that when I exported from Illustrator, it only exported where there was actual content. So what you have to do is go back into Illustrator and then make sure that you have some kind of outline at the outside of the page there. So what I'll do is I'll go back on this layer and I'll just draw an outline over the whole thing. That's just like a black line here, a black square. And so when I export this now as a bump map, I'll just save directly over the other bump map. This should work. Let's turn off the bump, make sure we have that outline again on diffuse or on reflection. File, export, reflection, save, yes. Okay, and then we want to do the same thing with opacity. So make sure again that you have something on the border of the page. File, export, opacity, save, yes. And now when you go back into Max, these should all update. You can hit reload on each of these to reload them. If they're not coming up, you can just kind of reselect here. Reflection, open. Make sure they're showing up in this little window here. This one was bump. And then this one was opacity. Okay, so now these should be working correctly. Yeah, that's applying a lot better. So you can see around the circle, that's where the perforation was. You could see the lines from the diffuse, the overall color, and then we should have some reflectivity in there as well. So let's go ahead and render this and see what happens. So you can see actually the whole geometry is reflecting, and the reason for that is that in the reflectivity map, it's actually using the white to be reflective. So I probably want to invert that. See, the black is what's creating the perforation there. You can see the green lines, but then in the reflection map, it's inverted from what I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this render, And then in the reflective one, reflection, double click on that, and you can actually go in here and then invert under output down here. So I'm going to invert it, which will change everything from black to white. So now when I render this again, you'll get the purple color, and then that little square there is where the reflectivity starts to happen. So you can see it's about 70% reflectivity. So you can start to make very complex maps. You can see the kind of bump that's happening there. It's actually bumping down as opposed to bumping up, but you could create like a bump around your perforations or even a displacement. But you can start making very complex surface textures, including perforation, reflectivity, color, just by doing these different maps in Photoshop and Rhino and Illustrator.